Thanks, Gaelic. My first question is in relation to Jigsaw Services. When people are seeking intervention, what are they presenting with in relation to that kind of cohort of people? What's the kind of, I know there's that kind of one fit, it's kind of fits all, but what are people presenting themselves?
Yeah, and I suppose I can give you the sense of our kind of top presenting issues at the moment have tended to be fairly typical over the last number of years, but their anxiety is the first and foremost, I think, followed by low mood and sleep disturbance. So they tend to be the big ticket items, and then I suppose what you need to get to is what's underneath that. So what's led to maybe that presentation of anxiety, and that's where we really open up that lived experience of the young person. So what we would do in Jigsaw is we'd invite a young person in, and often a parent, for part of that, if they're under 18, or even if they're over 18 and they want to have a supportive adult there. But we find out really what's been going on for them. We try and help them make sense about why they're feeling the way they're feeling at this time, and every young person will have a different story about why that is. There can be some common threads in that. We know that we've gone through a very particular point in our history, and that's bound to have an impact, but there's no two narratives that are the same. So while we can classify them and say anxiety is a big issue, and the research is telling us that young people are feeling highly anxious, the rates of or the levels of depression are at a higher rate. We know that there is a lot more prevalence of suicide and self-harm and things like that, but it's really what we're trying to do is get under the surface what's happening for that young person.
And is there any particular triggers that's a kind of a general narrative in situations like this?
Particular triggers, I mean, it really depends on the individual young person, and I suppose I'm mindful of the purpose of this subcommittee, and I think triggers can often happen at points of transition as well. So if we consider the tasks and journey of a young person through that, say, even 12 to 25 year period, we think about those points of time that require something new or different of the young person. So the first time I have to sit state exams, the first time I face a relationship breakup, the first time I get excluded by a group of friends, the first time that I have to start in third level education, or I don't get to go to third level education. And that's before we start to consider maybe young people who have those extra layers of challenge, who are growing up in marginalised communities, who are growing up in poverty, in unstable housing situations with specific health concerns or other levels of diversity that exclude them further. So there is any number of triggers, and I suppose what we're always trying to do is, rather than us come from a very expert level and say, well, we know what triggers young people's distress, we want to hear from young people about what's happening for them, and that's both in the session room and how we approach our therapeutic work, but very much in how we approach our youth participation strategies. So how we engage our youth advocates, because I'm too far away from it to understand what it's like to be 12 to 25, but we have young people who have a voice and want to tell us and want to share their experience. So we draw quite a lot from that as well to help us understand what is happening now.
And in terms of, say, intervention via, say, drugs, would that be kind of common?
In terms
in relation to, say, prescribed kind of medication, in relation to treating some of the conditions that you see?
In terms of using particular medications to manage. I suppose just to place where Jigsaw sit on the landscape is we're a non-medical service, and while we have complete appreciation for our colleagues who work in that medical model, it's not the model that we've been set up under. It's not how we conceptualise mental health as such, or how we view it. So there is, clinically, I would feel that there is a place for I think we need to be open to any intervention that might work for a young person, but I think what we need to steer away from is an assumption that one size fits all. So where some young people will and do tell us that they've benefited from carefully prescribed medication, there's other young people who feel that's not for them. And I think choice is the word that comes to my mind about how do we work collaboratively with young people, where we bring our expertise, and that's, I think, everyone around the table, psychiatry, social work, psychology, all of the allied health professionals, but that young people are equal partners at that table and are able to say, I hear you, but this is the way I want to go with it. And that's...
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Jigsaw don't have the remit to prescribe medications. They don't. Yeah. Okay.
That's
Exactly.
correct, yeah.
Okay. Just in relation to Dr. Duffy, this is kind of a broad kind of question. Does he see kind of there is a crisis in society, particularly around young people's mental health, particularly all the pressures that young people have to endure, particularly around social media? Kind of, I think it's very, it's difficult being young. We're all young and we all had difficulties, and some kind of some periods of our life are kind of, when you get the intervention, it's it makes it's revolutionary in some ways. But being young these days, there's so many kind of pressures on young people. It is different than it was, say, 20 years ago. But is there a kind of a crisis out there of people, how young people are kind of, I suppose, treated in society?
I think there certainly is, and I think that when I speak to the staff in the services, what they talk about is the levels of anxiety that young people experience. And then, when, as Conor was saying, when you begin to peel that back and you ask them what's behind that, a lot of it is around that sense of social comparison with it. Who am I? How do I fit in?
Exactly.
And if we think about, and Sarah's mentioned it earlier on, there's normal tasks in adolescence. The reason we have adolescence is that transition from being a child to an adult. So people can learn more about the world, they get a sense of their identity. There's a real sense for young people now of wanting to know immediately what their identity is, because other groups on Instagram or whatever other social media are gathered by identity. So rather than actually let it flow, let it work itself out, there's a real sense of everything needs to be immediate. So that is producing a lot of anxiety around it. Yeah. There's a lot of anxiety around that broader sense of identity, in terms of people would think about sexual identity, but now in a much broader sense. So there's constant feedback in that sense, as Conor mentioned earlier on, that experience of being excluded. And the other part of it, when we talk to the staff, what they say is that parents who are young parents themselves are finding it difficult in terms of how do they parent, and how can they parent a child now that is experiencing and used to using technology in a way that they're not used to using at all and have no understanding of that. So it's about trying to, how do you take some of the heat out of that? How do you say this is normal to go through lots of different feelings, have lots of different friendships, not know what you want to do in your life, all of those things. And how can we normalize that? And I think that there is still enormous pressure in terms of our education system, our expectations around, being in school full time for people who can't be, all sorts of different things with it.
And would you recommend any kind of, I suppose, solutions to not kind of young people to being, I know it's difficult, but not being caught up in all this kind of, I suppose, anxiety bubble, and it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. But if there's any kind of, in your professional opinion, is there anything that, young people should kind of steer away from? And I know it's difficult to do this.
It is difficult. I think I suppose it's about trying to think about what sort of a society do we want, and are we thinking about the individual, and if sports is their thing, brilliantly. If writing is their thing, or drama is their thing, or walking up a hill, or what is their thing, or what is their thing for now? How are we thinking about the broad education of young people, and what messages are we giving, and what do we prize? Are we, I talk to friends from abroad, and they're always quite surprised in terms of the hoo-ha in Ireland around the Leaving Cert. And back in my day, all of the points were published in the papers, and that sort of sense of we do this in a very, we almost take national pride in it, but that really does exclude people. It puts an enormous amount of pressure. So it's trying to think about what are the broad messages we want to give, and how do we help, I suppose, families and communities understand that looking after people's mental health is a normal everyday thing, and not something that can be just done in Jigsaw, or just done in CAMS, or just done in Piet, or just done somewhere else. So how do we manage some of those messages as a society? Is part of the bigger conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
If I could maybe just add to that as well. I mean, I suppose we're kind of focusing a little bit here on triggers and things to avoid, but equally there's a whole, body of evidence there to support things that actually young people can do to stay well and to protect their mental health. And one of those things that is key and that's really universal is around connectedness and belonging. And whether that's online, whether that's in a physical environment, whether that's in a campus or whether that's in a school or in a workplace, that is something that can be developed and can be really protective for young people. So I think we also need to focus very much on not only things that we want young people to avoid that may be harmful to their mental health, but also things that we can promote that may protect them and keep them well.
Okay. Sarah, would you like to comment?
Just, yeah, I have a couple of thoughts there, and I think what Declan was saying around the connectedness and belonging. Pre-pandemic, USI did some research into student mental health, and one of the key things we found was loneliness was a major issue. Despite, you know, at the time this was when everybody was still on campus and all of that, there was still a very high level of loneliness. And I think some of it comes from, we've moved a long way in terms of stigma reduction in this country. Like the conversation about mental health is national now.
Yeah.
And we do trot out the phrase, you know, it's okay to be not okay and it's okay to ask for help. And what we're kind of finding, particularly with the student population, is that's accepted, but not like on a general level, not for me as the individual. You know, there's a self-stigma still going around. And I think when we look at that sort of sense of anxiety as well, there's a lot of sort of perfectionism, you know, the need to you know, to get the first, not just pass the exam, you know, to get the best work experience, that kind of thing. And I think when all of those kind of things interplay, you get somebody who's got a lot of thoughts going around in their head, but not really reaching out to anybody about it. But if you spoke to them, they'd be like, oh yeah, no, people should definitely talk about their mental health.
Did you say loneliness?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was one of the main... Okay.
Very high levels among the student population pre-COVID.
Okay. And was there a reason for that?
We didn't tap into that within the survey, but you know, I think particularly when you're looking at that sense of perfectionism, it's a sense of not wanting to admit to their peers that they're struggling so much, which was an interesting finding, because on the flip side, there were a lot of people who wanted more information to build their confidence in how to support a friend. So it's kind of, it goes one direction but not the other direction. Everybody's prepared to help their friends, but nobody wants their friends to know that they're suffering themselves.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.